Welcome, my maid. Even though she must know I'm here for a marriage introduction, this is the first thing she says. What? I let out a voice of confusion, thinking I must have misheard. My future mother-in-law Linda looks at me with a mean smile. Oh, you weren't the maid? You've got such a poor-looking face. And the fiancé I thought was on my side betrayed me in the worst way. Glancing at my face, David bursts out laughing. You're right, she does have a poor-looking face. I'd love to see her parents. Really? I wonder if your parents would faint from shock at seeing a house as wealthy as ours. Linda and David kept looking down on me. They even looked down on my parents. I couldn't stand it any longer. I sent a message to my father while Linda and David were not looking. My father immediately replied that he will come right away. I'm going to get some fresh air. I can no longer bear listening to David's insults. Don't run away. David's crude laughter echoes. I left the seat to wait for my father's arrival. 10 minutes later, I introduced my father Christopher to David and his mother. Here's the slave's father. His voice is calm, but his eyes are not smiling. Wait, father! Linda, knowing my father's face, freezes in a grand manner. I am Susan. Turning 30 this year. Working in a small company, I've lived my life trying not to stand out. Thus, my usual makeup is just foundation. And I prefer wearing navy or black. I don't wear contacts, and instead, wear thick glasses due to my high prescription. The reason for being so thorough is because my father had a high-profile job, and I've been influenced by it since childhood. My father is an actor. Apparently, he was quite popular back in the day, often surrounded by women when walking through town. Though a supporting role, he appears on TV quite often and is moderately well known. Middle school was quite tough because of my father. Classmates would ask for his autograph, and their parents would ask to meet him. Since I refused all these requests, I was often criticized. I must have seemed unfair to them. I even faced harassment from jealous classmates. I didn't want to trouble my beloved father. I also hated the thought of being seen as the one getting carried away. Struggling with these thoughts, I dressed plainly and went to a high school where no one knew me. Fortunately, I had a common surname, so I could live normally from high school. And maybe because of my plain appearance, men didn't approach me. Thus, I could enjoy a carefree student life. I loved talking about comics with my female friends, and those times felt like the happiest. I met my fiancé David after becoming a working adult. David worked for the leasing company of the copy machine our company uses. My direct interactions with David were minimal. David would regularly check on the copy machine, and we would exchange a few words during his visits. Our relationship took a significant turn when the copy machine broke. That day, I was busy preparing materials for a meeting happening the next day. But then, the copy machine stopped working. I was in trouble. Without it, I wouldn't be able to prepare the materials for tomorrow's meeting. In panic, I called David. He came quickly and checked the copy machine. Can it be fixed? I asked David anxiously, and he replied with a smile. Don't worry. I'll take care of it. I fell in love with David's smile in an instant. The rest is history. Unfortunately, the copy machine wasn't fixed, but David arranged for a replacement. We managed to prepare the materials in time for the meeting. Having fallen for David, I made an effort to get closer to him. I asked for his contact information and called him often. Then, I confessed my feelings to David, and we started dating. David was always very kind. He was always considerate, and I had never seen him angry. I thought he would continue to be kind even after knowing about my father. So, after dating for 3 months, I boldly proposed to David. He happily accepted. I remember being very happy. However, there was one thing I was concerned about. It was my appearance. I had always worn thick glasses. Even on dates, I dressed plainly. It's a habit that's hard to break. The real me looks just like my father, with distinct features. Because of my appearance, I was envied by girls in middle school. I've been judged by guys based on my looks before, and it's been tough. But I thought it would be okay with David. From now on, I thought of changing my appearance little by little for David, whom I love. That's what I thought. However, after getting engaged to David, I started feeling more and more uncomfortable. Before our engagement, David seemed like a kind person, but recently he started making remarks that seemed to look down on me. The other day, we went to a bridal fair to decide on a wedding venue, since David suggested it. The place David took me to was a dazzling world. It was a luxurious guest house, perfect for a large wedding with over 100 guests. Seeing that scene, I felt confused. I don't have many friends from my school days, and I didn't want to stand out, so I had hoped for a small ceremony at a small venue. I wanted to go home right away, but David seemed to be enjoying himself, so I couldn't bring it up. So, I endured and spent the time there. After it was all over and we stopped by a cafe, David was in a very good mood. The wedding venue we saw earlier was nice, wasn't it? I personally would like something even more extravagant, he said while drinking coffee. This could mean we end up choosing the venue we saw earlier. Feeling anxious, I decided to talk to David about what I wanted. I was thinking a wedding with just the two of us might be nice. I don't like standing out too much. I thought the kind David would surely compromise. However, the reality was completely different. David looked at me and laughed scornfully. Indeed, a plain girl like you wouldn't suit a venue like we saw earlier. There's probably no dress that suits those thick glasses of yours. What? I was bewildered by David's remark. Isn't a wedding about both families? My family is wealthy, and not having a certain level of wedding would be embarrassing, he continued. I was speechless. The David who had always been kind was now looking down on me as if he was a different person. I was deeply shocked by David's attitude. And to the bewildered me, David made an even worse comment. You should just keep quiet and do as I say. A plain woman like you should be grateful to be getting married at all. Suddenly, David became serious, throwing harsh words at me. I was so baffled by his remark. I even felt scared by David's words. Then the next moment, David smiled and said, I'll decide everything for you, so you just need to do as I say. Okay. I didn't know how to respond and just smiled awkwardly. Maybe getting engaged to David was a mistake. But it's too late to act as if it never happened. I've already reported our engagement to both our parents and my company. And despite all this, I still loved David. Maybe he would return to the kind David I knew before our engagement. So, despite my confusion about David's change, I had no choice but to continue with the engagement. David continued to make comments that troubled me. With each one, my heart grew more wounded. But I couldn't bring myself to hate David. Even when I thought about breaking up, the kind David I knew flashed through my mind. I still love David after all. Despite my confusion about David's change, I continued our relationship. And then one day, something happened that confused me even more. It was the day David and I finalized our wedding venue. After visiting several venues, David decided on the luxurious guest house we first visited. With pride, David said, I guess a lavish ceremony really suits me. It's unfortunate for you, though. David laughed, hurting me. And for the paperwork of the wedding venue, We went to that guest house with David. On the way, I encountered someone. "Oh, is that you, David?" "Mom, what are you doing here?" David looked surprised at the woman. Then David introduced her to me. "Susan, this is my mom, Linda." "Mom, this is Susan. She's my fiancée. I told you I was getting married, remember?" Linda greeted me with a smile. "I'm David's mother. You seem like a serious woman. Where do you work? You must be working at a major corporation, right?" This was my first meeting with David's mother. I answered nervously about my company and that I do clerical work. Then Linda made a puzzled face. "I've never heard of that company." That's when David joined our conversation. "Susan's company is one of my sales destinations. It's a small company with about 30 employees, so it's natural that you don't know it." Upon hearing David's explanation, Linda's face turned grim. "I thought since you were David's fiancée, you'd be working at a more reputable company. Doesn't that mean your salary is low? Are you planning to make David suffer?" "I'm sorry. Indeed, my salary isn't very high at my current company. That's why I had no choice but to apologize to Linda." Then, Linda sighed heavily and said, "Can you at least not rely entirely on David? Our family is of a distinguished lineage. We don't need a woman of unclear origin." "Okay." I responded to Linda's remark with confusion, but Linda became even more heated. "What about your parents? They work at reputable companies, right?" Linda glared at me with narrowed eyes. My father is." As I was about to answer Linda's question with confusion, my eyes drifted to her bag. Because I saw something familiar. Then I fell silent. Seeing me, David spoke up. "Come on, Mom, calm down. We're going to visit the house and make our marriage introduction soon." "All right, though I'm not really in a welcoming mood." Linda glared at me with a sour face. It seems my first impression on Linda was the worst. The path to marriage seemed too steep, and I secretly sighed. And then came the day of the marriage introduction. Wow. I couldn't help but mutter in front of David's family home. The scene before me far exceeded my expectations. Since Linda had mentioned that their family was of a distinguished lineage, I had expected David's family to be wealthy. But the reality before me was even more astonishing. The gate was automatic, there was an elevator inside. And there were even 10 luxury cars parked outside. Surely, they must be the hobbies of my father-in-law. David then spoke to me. "Dad is out for work today. It's just Mom, so make yourself comfortable," David said with a smile, but my face became even more strained. Linda had been harsh to me last time. Surely, she will make some sarcastic remarks again. Then, David and I entered the living room where Linda was waiting. "Hello. Thank you for the other day," I greeted Linda politely. The next moment, Linda said something unbelievable. "Welcome, my maid." Even though she must know I'm here for a marriage introduction, this is the first thing she says. "What?" I let out a voice of confusion, thinking I must have misheard. Linda looks at me with a mean smile. "Oh, you weren't the maid? You've got such a poor-looking face." A maid? How could she say something so terrible? Then Linda laughed with a look of enjoyment. "David told me. It's okay to treat you like a maid. It seems like David just wanted to marry someone who would do as he says. Too bad for you." "David, what do you mean?" I asked David with a pale face. It must be a bad joke. I wanted to believe that. And the fiancé I thought was on my side betrayed me in the worst way. Glancing at my face, David bursts out laughing. You're right, she does have a poor-looking face. I'd love to see her parents. Maybe we could use her parents as our servants too. David laughs vulgarly. Indeed, having someone obedient for free is attractive. But if they come to a wealthy house like ours, I wonder if Susan's parents would faint from shock. Linda and David continue to look down on me. And Linda asks with a laugh, "By the way, what does your father do? He's not homeless, is he?" "That's not." Then David burst into laughter and replied to Linda, "Mom, that's not a job. Since Susan is like this, it's certain he doesn't have a stable job." I'm laughing so hard my stomach hurts. David and Linda continue to look down on my parents. They assumed my family's education was low and decided they must have a plain appearance. I grit my teeth in frustration, listening to their remarks. Linda and David were too rude. They even looked down on my parents. I couldn't stand it any longer. I sent a message to my father while Linda and David weren't looking. "I need you to come now." I also sent him the map to David's family home, which David had sent me for today's marriage introduction. I remembered that today was my father's day off. He must be relaxing at home right now. Fortunately, my father replied within a minute. "I'm on my way." Seeing my father's reply, I felt relieved. Then I spoke to David and Linda. "I'm feeling a bit unwell, so I'm going to get some fresh air." I couldn't bear listening to David and his remarks any longer. I thought I would wait outside quietly until my father arrived. That's what I thought. "Oh, is that so? Well then, David, why don't we continue our tea leisurely?" Linda seemed pleased to be alone with David. "Susan, don't you run away." David's crude laughter echoed. I left the seat and waited outside for my father's arrival. 10 minutes later, my father appeared wearing dark sunglasses. "Susan, what's wrong? Today was supposed to be your marriage introduction, right? I was surprised to be called out all of a sudden." My father asked me with a puzzled look. "Dad, I'm just so frustrated." Seeing my father, I felt relieved and started to cry. No matter how much I tried to hold back, tears kept flowing. "What's wrong, Susan?" My father began to panic seeing me cry. I explained everything to my father. How David's attitude changed after we got engaged. And how Linda joined him in looking down on me. "I can't forgive them for looking down on you without knowing anything about you." I couldn't stop crying as I explained. My father listened to my story silently. But it seemed he was quietly angry. Then I told my father something about Linda. At that moment, my father laughed. He took off his sunglasses and handed them to me. "We're going in now. I'll make sure they regret hurting you." I made up my mind with my father's words. My love for David had faded. All that was left was hatred. "I've made my decision. We'll make David and his mom regret it." I did something, then put on my father's sunglasses. Then, together with my father, we entered David's family home. I stood in front of David and Linda, bringing my father with me. "Sorry to keep you waiting." Me, standing firm with my father. Seeing me wearing sunglasses. "Why are you suddenly wearing sunglasses?" Linda, who initially laughed seeing me, became stunned upon seeing the man beside me. I realized people freeze when they are too surprised. Surely, Linda must have thought she could say something terrible again when I returned. But unfortunately for her, I won't let things go her way. I'm planning to drag her through hell instead. Linda must already recognize who my father was. Then, my father spoke to Linda. "I'm the maid's father." His voice was calm, but his eyes were not smiling. His handsome face made him appear even more formidable. What? Linda, who likely recognized my father, was shocked. How could this be? Why is Christopher here? Is this some sort of surprise? Linda spoke with agitation, her cheeks turning a bit red. Her eyes sparkled like those of a young girl. David seemed clueless, standing there stunned. My father didn't answer Linda's question, but kept staring at David and Linda. Linda blushed under my father's gaze. It's embarrassing for a woman of her age. I looked at Linda coldly. Then David, regaining his composure, asked in confusion. Christopher? Mom, is he a friend of yours? David probably doesn't know about my father. I guess he's quite well known among Linda's generation. But younger people might not know unless they watch dramas on TV. Then Linda glared at David. David! How rude of you! This man is a famous actor and my first love. What? David looked incredulous. Then Linda turned towards my father, smiling and speaking to him. I'm a big fan of you, Christopher. See, look at this. Linda brought out her purse to show my father. It's a keychain that can only be bought by a fan club member. I've been a fan of you for over 20 years. Linda began to express her admiration as a longtime fan of my father. Mom. David seemed appalled by Linda's sudden change in behavior. Linda continued to speak to my father. Surely, the presence of her favorite actor had greatly elevated her mood. However, my father's gaze on Linda was very stern. Then, after remaining silent until now, my father finally spoke up. I understand that you're a fan of mine. However, did you try to treat my precious daughter, Susan, as a maid? Linda, who had been highly spirited until now, turned pale and froze. She trembled visibly, which was evident from her shaking. Ignoring Linda, my father continued. And you assumed I was homeless without even meeting me. That's quite rude of you. Saying so, my father glared at Linda. Linda started to panic. No! I didn't know Susan's father was you. Having you join the family is more than welcome. Right, David? Yes, of course. David seemed pushed by Linda. Then, Linda tried to justify herself to my father. I was dumbfounded listening to Linda. She had been looking down on me and my father until she saw him. And just like that, she changed her tone. It was nothing but distrust. If you look closely, Susan is a wonderful woman who resembles Christopher, and my earlier comments were just out of jealousy for fear of losing my son. If I had known about you, I would have behaved more politely. Linda desperately tried to make amends. My father looked at her as if she was bothersome. Watching their interaction, I thought, I can't let my father be troubled any further. This was my issue. I should be the one to speak up to Linda. So, I told Linda, I'm breaking off the engagement with David, so there's no way you'll become family with Dad. What? Susan, I'm sorry. This is my chance to become family with Christopher. Please reconsider. Linda tried to persuade me with a face that looked almost tearful. After all her terrible behavior towards me, even her tearful face couldn't be trusted. I looked at her coldly. Yet, Linda thought she could somehow convince me seeing me silent. She smiled at me. You want to marry David, don't you? I won't oppose to it anymore, it's okay. I'll do anything for you. Linda clung to me, desperate to become family with my father. Her willingness to do anything was the complete opposite of her initial stance. I felt contempt for Linda, who changed her opinions so frequently. I murmured softly, No, Thank you.
What? What did you say?
Linda tilted her head, as if she hadn't heard me. So, I shouted louder this time.
I absolutely do not want to become family with you. What?
Linda was taken aback by my outcry. I confronted Linda with my feelings.
You made derogatory remarks the moment you heard about my job. And you spoke terribly about my father. I can never forgive that.
I made my stance clear to Linda.
But,
seeing Linda turn to my father as if realizing persuading me was futile, she spoke to him with a smile.
Susan says this, but Christopher, you want your daughter to be happy, right? Our family is wealthy, and surely your daughter will be happy with us.
Indeed, some people might think happiness comes with money. But not me. Perhaps understanding my feelings, my father countered Linda's words.
Susan values love over money. Besides, our family has money. I, being an actor, earn a decent amount.
Linda was at a loss for words. It wasn't surprising. After all, my father is a famous actor who frequently appears in dramas and doesn't struggle with money. Given our family's wealth, there's no merit for me to marry just for money. Linda fell silent, likely unable to come up with a good counter-argument. Then, seeing Linda silent, my father continued.
You say you're a fan of mine, but I despise someone who neglects my precious daughter. Could you please not call yourself a fan anymore?
Saying that, my father glared at Linda. Then Linda burst into tears.
If Christopher hates me, I won't be able to live.
Linda sobbed uncontrollably. Until now silent, David began to speak.
Seeing me silent, you've been making quite a remark, Susan. You'll regret it if you break off our engagement. No one will want someone like you.
David laughed.
Wait a minute, David.
Linda, concerned about my father, tried to stop David. But David didn't stop.
I chose a plain woman like you thinking you'd be obedient. I was planning to cheat on you with cute girls once we were married. So annoying that my plan's not going to work anymore.
Hearing David talk about things I hadn't even asked, I calmly realized. There was never any love from David. He just wanted a convenient woman who would obey him. My love for David had long since faded. While I was thinking this, David kept making selfish statements.
You!
My father gritted his teeth, looking like he might grab David any moment. It seemed like my turn to fight back.
Dad, wait!
So, I stopped my father. I let out a smile while still wearing my sunglasses.
What's up?
David seemed a bit taken aback by my composed smile.
Is this still plain?
I took off the sunglasses I was wearing with a flourish.
What?
David froze, looking at my face. It was only natural. I had applied makeup after meeting my father and crying. Normally, I only wore foundation. But now, I had on eyeshadow, mascara, and eyeliner. I had done my makeup right after crying over meeting my father. Though it was just eye makeup, I think it significantly changed my appearance.
Is that really you, Susan?
David's face turned a bit red. He must have been mesmerized by my makeup-enhanced face.
Yes, it's me. I've always downplayed my looks to avoid standing out, but I've decided to stop hiding myself.
Until now, I stood out unwillingly because of my father. So, I had been modest to avoid attention. But being spoken ill of by David and Linda made me think it's okay to stand out a bit and show my true self. David, with a flushed face, said,
If you had been like this from the beginning, I would have been nice to you. Even now, we can start over. Come on, let's get engaged again. and introduce me to some beautiful actresses through your father.
Who would go on with the engagement now? And the audacity to ask for actress introductions. I made my stance clear to David.
The engagement is over. I don't need someone like you anymore. I'll cancel the wedding venue too. What?
David was stunned. But I wasn't about to let him off that easily. I continued to corner David.
Of course, you'll be bearing the cancellation fee for the wedding venue. That's only fair.
Linda exclaimed in confusion. Wait a minute. It's too much to bear the entire cost. David, looking perplexed, was unable to retort. Then my father spoke up.
Why not have David's father cover it? With all those luxury cars, it shouldn't be a problem, right?
My father said this with a refreshing smile. Here, I played my trump card.
If you're not satisfied, we can go to court. But remember, my father is a famous actor. News about this might provoke his extreme fans, who could retaliate.
My father has many enthusiastic fans. A critic who once badmouthed my father as a poor actor faced severe consequences. Prank calls, letters with knives, the extent of the harassment was unimaginable. It was even covered in the news at one point. Linda, recalling that incident, turned pale. She frantically persuaded David.
David, you must bear all the cancellation fees. We don't know what might happen.
Seeing Linda's expression, David seemed to grasp the gravity of the situation.
What? Are you kidding?
David fell to his knees, a look of despair on his face.
I don't need you in my life. Dad, let's go home.
Ignoring the dejected David and Linda, I left the place with my father. The engagement with David was thus broken off for good. And David ended up being responsible for the entire cancellation fee of the wedding venue. It turns out, my father-in-law is the head of a company, and my father had once appeared in a commercial for that company. Because of this connection between my father and my father-in-law, my father informed him about David and Linda's actions. Naturally unaware of the situation, my father-in-law was furious. He confronted David and Linda harshly. He even pressured David to bear the full cost of the wedding venue cancellation. As a result, David was saddled with a hefty financial burden. The repercussions extended to Linda as well. She was faced with divorce initiated by my father-in-law. Their treatment of us was one thing, but that wasn't the only reason. Apparently, Linda had a habit of wasteful spending. She had spent a considerable amount on fan activities for my father. The source of this spending was my father-in-law's money. It seems my father-in-law had already lost patience with Linda. Moreover, my father revealed that Linda had sent him rather inappropriate love letters.
I want to divorce and marry you, Christopher. My current husband is just a source of money.
She had written such content in love letters to my father. This enraged my father-in-law. Despite Linda's resistance, the divorce was finalized with the involvement of lawyers. I heard rumors that Linda,
this wasn't supposed to happen,
was living in tears, lamenting. Additionally, she was expelled from my father's fan club. She had engaged in quite troublesome fan activities, so it was probably inevitable. I can't imagine happiness coming Linda's way after losing everything. It's a case of getting what she deserved. 6 months later. Astonishingly, David was arrested. The reason was his stalking behavior towards me. Unable to forget me after I took off my sunglasses that day, David began to frequently appear in front of me. He started to loiter in front of my house. Even after I quit my job, he called me often,
begging me to reconsider the engagement, crying over the phone, I need you, no one else will do. but he was only fixated on my looks.
Then crying, David clung to his phone, but in the end, he was probably only looking at my face. It's a huge difference from before and after I put on makeup.
I don't need a man who only judges by looks.
I politely refused and then blocked his calls. However, David's actions only escalated. I consulted the police several times. And sometimes, I was threatened with danger. After much deliberation, I finally filed a report with the police. My father agreed with this decision. Ultimately, David was arrested for trying to forcibly enter our house. Following his arrest, it seems David was fired from his job. All that's left for David now is a significant amount of debt. Surely, he won't be able to lead a decent life anymore. It's the punishment for looking down on people so much. Since then, I have been working as my father's manager. The job is much more challenging than my previous clerical work. Managing my father's schedule, accompanying him on site visits, making rounds of greetings, to negotiating salaries. Previously, I was just commuting between the company and home as a clerk. I only occasionally talked to people in the office and mostly faced the computer. Now, meeting people has become the main part of my job, and I talk much more. It's a big change from before. However, I now find it incredibly enjoyable. Being a manager is a glamorous job, but it's not just about that. I support my father behind the scenes so he can concentrate on his acting career. The work hours are irregular, and adaptability is required. Above all, it's a job that allows me to support my father closely. I want to repay him properly for all the worry I've caused. It's a job I've just started. There will surely be many challenges. But I want to face forward and do my best. Beside my beloved father, I continue to do my best today.
Marriage scam. I was a bit shocked that something like that could happen so close to home. Her son now has a new girlfriend, and the parents seemed relieved. The reunion went on smoothly and eventually came to an end. Instead of going to the after party, I returned to my hotel and enjoyed a nightcap by myself. Come to think of it, I forgot to check in with my husband. It was only 10 p.m., he should still be up. I tried to call home, but no matter how many times I let it ring, my husband didn't answer. Maybe he had already gone to sleep. Well, I was going back tomorrow anyway, so it wasn't a problem. Still, I had an uneasy feeling. Was it a woman's intuition? I had a bad feeling for some reason. From then on, my husband started coming home extremely late on weekdays, and he started coming home drunk almost every night. Hey, I'm home. You, coming home so drunk. Are you okay? In a drunken stupor, my husband threw his shoes off and sprawled out on the living room floor. Shut up, I'm home. Show some respect. Respect for what, exactly? His slovenly state? While picking up my husband's discarded socks and shirt, I kept my thoughts to myself. Alyssa was cute, wasn't she? You know, if you were as young as Alyssa. That's what my husband said. Who the hell is Alyssa? What does he mean if I were young? By the time I thought to question him, he was already fast asleep. Could he be cheating on me? My unease from that day was becoming more and more like conviction. No, my husband is a decent man. There's no way he could. It must be drunken nonsense, I reassured myself. But then there's my husband who leaves early in the morning on weekends and doesn't return until late at night. I'll be back later. Take care. And then he comes home drunk, as always. With this happening every week, even I had to intervene. You seem to be going out drinking almost every day recently. Are we okay financially? Mind your own business. It's my money and I'll do what I want with it. It's the savings from my bachelor days. But we need to save up for our old age or we'll be in trouble in the future. Why don't you save up then? Well, I've spent quite a bit on treatments. That's because you're defective. Even if he was drunk, I couldn't believe he'd speak to me that way. I was starting to notice my husband's changes. Did I become more submissive since I stopped treatment? My husband's disparaging remarks about me were increasing. Since you can't have kids, you should show your affection for me instead. and with that, I could feel my love for him diminishing as he splurged and behaved selfishly. He used to be so kind, caring for me when I was having a hard time with treatments. Will he ever return to being that kind of husband? What is a marriage, really? After 20 years, I started to question this. However, things took a sudden turn. Lisa, we need to talk. I came home from work to find my husband sitting on the living room sofa, looking serious. What is it? You're being all formal. I want a divorce. What? You're joking, right? Why would you say that all of a sudden? The thought that my husband was considering a divorce had never crossed my mind. Yes, I knew we had to reconsider our relationship as a married couple, but I hadn't thought about divorce. Was my husband thinking of divorce before I even considered it? Out of the blue, you want a divorce? What's going on? I confronted my husband, seeking answers. We've been a couple for 20 years, haven't we? Let's discuss this properly. However, he looked at me with contempt. You're really clueless, aren't you? He sighed heavily, glaring at me. What do you mean? I've always wanted children for these past 20 years. And because I got stuck with a defective piece like you, I've been robbed of the opportunity to become a father. Have you ever considered my feelings? As he spoke, he pounded the table with an arrogant tone. That's not fair. We discussed together and decided to stop the treatments, remember? I was never okay with that. I've always wanted a child. Why hadn't he told me that then? I was on the verge of tears, overwhelmed by sadness and frustration. Well, if you sign the divorce papers, I won't have anything else to say. Proudly, he pushed the divorce papers on the table towards me. I've actually already decided to remarry. What? Remarry? Yeah, with a 20-year-old girl. A girl? Are you saying you've been having an affair? No way. I plan on marrying her as soon as we're divorced. He announced this with a smug satisfaction. A 20-year-old girl was marrying my husband? This couldn't be happening. Alyssa, she's sweet and cute. The perfect wife. Not like you. Alyssa. That was the name my husband had mentioned that day. Woman's intuition was not to be underestimated. I felt a sense of self-satisfaction, but this wasn't the time for self-praise. And then my husband showed me a picture of his adorable Alyssa. Upon taking a closer look, I nearly burst out laughing. This has to be a joke. Something like this was impossible. What? He noticed my strange reaction, but I quickly regained my composure. I felt it was too soon to let him in on the joke, so I immediately composed myself. So you really want a child that badly? Yes, because you can't give birth. There's nothing we can do about that, right? You will agree to divorce, won't you? Well, I suppose there's no choice. I pretend to look more upset than I really am. Sure, I was upset when he first brought up the divorce, but now, with his sheer stupidity, I feel like it would be right to divorce him immediately. Yes, I should leave a man like this sooner or later. I feel as if I've been given divine guidance to do so. I sign the divorce papers and leave my husband behind. I'll bet he'll regret this soon enough. Well, let's just watch and see. Fast forward a year after the divorce. Lisa, please help me. A shabby-looking man approaches me on my way home from work. Excuse me, who are you? I genuinely don't recognize him. It's me, Lisa. I need your help. It's my ex-husband. Long time no see. I'm taken aback by how much he's changed. His cheeks are sunken, and he's dressed shabbily. Please, Alice, introduce me to your company's lawyer. I can't just do that out of the blue. Apparently, my ex-husband is having money troubles. I could sort of tell from his appearance, but I never thought he would become a completely different person within a year. If it's your first time, consultation is free. Free? But if you want to hire them, you'll have to pay their fee. I don't have that kind of money. Please, help me. What on earth happened? I decided to listen to his story at a nearby cafe out of pity. Well, actually, before he could say another word, I cut him off. Did that girl, Alyssa, run off? How did you know? Just as I thought. When my ex-husband showed me a picture of a girl named Alyssa, it clicked. That girl looked exactly like the one who conned a classmate's son at a reunion. At that reunion, the classmate was saying, "I can't forgive that woman," and showed her picture around, warning everyone. I think her name was Sally and she was about 22. Well, her age and name are probably fake. It makes sense. The swindler wouldn't use her real name, of course. You knew about Alyssa, didn't you? Well, I guess you could say I knew, but what happened? When I asked my husband for the details, this was the story he gave. He met a woman named Alyssa about a year ago in a nightclub. My husband, who has always wanted children, seemed to have been venting such thoughts in his conversations with her. That's when Alyssa said, "I can have a child for you." The two gradually deepened their relationship after that. My husband would go to the club almost every weekday and would date Alyssa outside the club on weekends, then return to the club. In doing so, he ended up using $10,000 from his savings that he had accumulated when he was single. But Alyssa was so sweet, she never asked for expensive things even when we were outside the club. She was just happy drinking with me at the club. She was different from the stereotypical opportunistic club girls you often hear about. She didn't need designer goods or jewelry. She was satisfied if I was there drinking with her at the club. She was hardworking and sincere. We had agreed not to touch each other's savings from when we were single, so I never noticed anything. I thought it was his money and he could use it as he pleased. I had no idea he was spending that much. And then Alyssa showed her true colors. "I want to get married, but I have debts, so I need to repay them, and it's about $20,000. Then my husband promised to take on Alyssa's debt and transferred the money to her. They moved in together right after our divorce, but Alyssa continued her night work and rarely came home. And then she quit her job at the club and disappeared. Of course, she took all the money and ran. Just how foolish can he be? I started to feel pathetic for having been married to such a man for 20 years. Did you make a promissory note? A what? When I asked, my husband looked puzzled. You lent her money, didn't you? Didn't you get a note? We were going to be a couple, so I didn't do such a thing. Really? So doesn't it mean you just gave her the money? Is that so? In this case, it seems like you donated $20,000 to Alyssa out of goodwill. This woman must be a pro. In the case of donations, if the amount exceeds $11,000 in a year, gift tax is imposed. Depending on the case, the receiver might be taxed, so Alyssa just took $20,000 in cash and vanished. And she split the money into 2 parts across 2 different years. That way she wouldn't exceed the $11,000 limit and could avoid taxes. The reason my husband thought she was a good girl who never asked for material gifts was because she knew the law well. So what should I do? I don't know, maybe consult a lawyer? It'll cost you though. Upon hearing that, my husband's shoulders slumped. I've used up all my savings from my single days. The woman I loved ran away from me. I can't tell the company that the marriage is off after I've already told them about remarrying. I boasted about getting a younger wife. Isn't that his own doing? Although I thought that, seeing his pitiful situation, I couldn't say anything. Lisa, it's my fault. Please, come back to me. I realized after you were gone, you were the only one who cared about me. I don't need kids anymore. I'll let you do as you like. You must have been lonely too, right? Does my husband still misunderstand that I still love him? That matter ended half a year ago in my mind, so I confronted him with reality. You know, it's been a year. What's with this sudden change of heart? Isn't it a little too late now? Lisa, are you going to abandon me? Well, it was you who pushed for our divorce in the first place, remember? Lisa, you're the only one I can rely on. My ex-husband looked utterly exhausted. I decided to show him a little mercy. All right then, shall I call up a lawyer friend of mine? Lisa, thank you. I knew I could count on you. With tears welling up in his eyes, my ex-husband seemed genuinely grateful. And the one who came to the coffee shop was Mr. Johnson, the lawyer from my company. John, over here. Lisa, who's this? He's an acquaintance. Seems he's in a bit of a bind. Is that so? Nice to meet you. The name's Johnson. My ex-husband seemed somewhat perplexed by our overly familiar demeanor. You see, we've been dating for the past 6 months. Now what was it you needed advice on? As I finished speaking, my ex-husband looked as if he was in a daze. No, well, I think that'll be it for today. Suddenly snapping back to reality, my ex-husband hurriedly left the coffee shop. In the end, he couldn't afford to hire a lawyer, and resigned himself to his fate. Rumor has it that his company has been abuzz with talk of his unfortunate situation, left by his soon-to-be wife, ignored by his ex-wife. It's a small world. Who would have thought that one of his colleagues was at the same coffee shop, overhearing the entire conversation from start to finish? I heard through the grapevine that he's frantically trying to find a new partner, terrified of facing old age alone. Who was that guy? When Mr. Johnson asked me about it later, I told him the whole story. I'm sorry for involving you in all this. The truth is... I see. You've had quite the ordeal, Lisa. The part about me dating Mr. Johnson was a complete lie. I had asked him to play along with the charade. Sorry for all the trouble. No worries, Lisa. I'm glad I could be of help. By the way, do you have any plans after this? Excuse me? How about grabbing something to eat if you'd like? Caught off guard by this unexpected turn of events, I was a little flustered. A fresh start in my mid-40s. This isn't such a bad beginning. Yes, I'd love to. I was certain a fun-filled future was awaiting me. I couldn't shake off this feeling.
My name is Ashley, and I never thought my life would change so dramatically in just 1 year. Looking back now, I can't help but laugh at how naive I was about what I thought was my perfect marriage. 4 years ago, at age 30, I married Robert. We seemed like the perfect match. I was climbing the corporate ladder as a project manager at Richardson Financial, while he was content with his position as a manager at TradeWorks. Unlike many of my colleagues' husbands who were constantly chasing promotions, Robert preferred a simpler life. He'd come home early, cook dinner, and we'd spend quiet evenings together. I earned more than him, but it never seemed to bother him. In fact, he seemed to enjoy having a successful wife. "Honey, I made your favorite pasta tonight," he'd say almost every Friday, greeting me with a kiss as I walked through the door, exhausted from another long week of meetings and deadlines. "You spoil me too much," I'd reply, breathing in the familiar scent of garlic and herbs that filled our rented house. We had our routines, our inside jokes, our shared dreams. We were saving for our own place, and the joint account kept growing steadily. We had already saved $200,000, not enough for our dream home yet, but we were getting there. "We'll have our own place soon," Robert would say, scrolling through real estate listings on his phone while we cuddled on the couch. "Just another year or two of saving." I'd nod, imagining our future together. We talked about having kids someday, but we both agreed to wait until we had our own place. Everything seemed so clear, so certain. Then came that Tuesday in March. I remember it perfectly because it was the day everything started to unravel, though I didn't know it yet. I was in the middle of presenting quarterly projections to the board when the room started spinning. The faces around the conference table blurred, and the last thing I heard was someone shouting my name before everything went black. I woke up in the emergency room, surrounded by concerned faces and the steady beep of monitors. A doctor with kind eyes and graying hair was standing by my bed, holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Parker," he said gently, "we need to run some additional tests, but the preliminary scan shows something concerning. There appears to be a mass in your brain." The word mass echoed in my head like a death sentence. I felt my world tilting again, but this time I remained conscious, painfully aware of every word that followed. "We'll need to do more extensive testing to determine if it's benign and if surgery is possible," the doctor continued. "I need to be honest with you, even if surgery is an option, there's a significant risk of long-term disability." I nodded mechanically, my mind already racing to Robert. How would he take this news? Would he stay by my side if I became disabled? We had promised in sickness and in health, but this was different. This was real. I took a cab home from the hospital that evening, my mind racing with how to break the news to Robert. When I opened our front door, I found him in the kitchen, humming while stirring something that smelled like beef stew. The normalcy of it all made my heart ache. "Robert," I called out softly, still standing in the doorway. "I need to tell you something." He turned around, wooden spoon in hand, and must have seen something in my face, because the smile immediately dropped from his. "What's wrong, Ash?" I told him everything, the fainting spell, the hospital, the tumor. His face grew increasingly pale as I spoke, but what happened next caught me completely off guard. "Will you be able to keep working?" he asked, setting down the spoon. "What happens if you have to quit? Do we have enough money?" I stood there, stunned. My husband had just learned I might be dying or face permanent disability, and his first concern was about money? About my ability to work? "We have our savings," I managed to reply, trying to keep the hurt from my voice. "It should be enough to get us through the initial period. We can figure out the rest later." Right, he nodded, running his hands through his hair. "The savings. Okay." The next few weeks were a blur of doctor's appointments and tests. I tried to maintain my normal work schedule, but it became increasingly difficult. The headaches were getting worse, and some days I could barely focus on my computer screen. "Ashley, you need to take some time off," my boss, Sarah Mitchell, finally said after finding me with my head in my hands one afternoon. "We can arrange for 6 months of medical leave. Your health has to come first." I knew she was right, but being at home all day was harder than I expected. The walls seemed to close in on me as I lay on the couch, wondering if each day might be one of my last. Would I die? Would I survive but never be the same? The questions tormented me endlessly. And then there was Robert's changing behavior. He started coming home later and later, sometimes well past midnight. When I asked him about it, he'd always have the same response. "I'm picking up extra shifts, Ash. We need the money for your treatment. You understand, right?" I'd nod, too exhausted from my own fears to probe further. Sometimes I'd hear him on the phone in another room, speaking in hushed tones, but I told myself he was probably just dealing with work stuff. My mind was occupied with darker thoughts. What would happen if the tumor was malignant? If I survived but ended up paralyzed? Would Robert stick around to take care of a disabled wife? After weeks of trying to handle everything on my own, I finally broke down and called my mother. I'd been avoiding it, not wanting to worry her at her age. She'd had me late in life and was now in her 70s. But I needed her, more than I'd ever needed her before. "Mom," I said when she answered the phone, my voice cracking. "I'm sick." As soon as I explained everything, she didn't hesitate. "I'm coming over right now, sweetheart. Pack my bag this minute." She arrived the next day. I was having one of my bad days, barely able to make it from the bedroom to the bathroom without getting dizzy. She took one look at me and switched into full mother mode, just like when I was a little girl with the flu. Having Mom there was like being wrapped in a warm blanket. She cooked, cleaned, made sure I took my medications on time, and most importantly, held my hand during the worst moments when the fear became overwhelming. But not everyone was happy about her presence. Robert's face would tighten every time he came home and found her there. He'd force a smile and retreat to the bedroom, or suddenly remember work emails he had to send. "Your mother doesn't have to stay here all the time," he said one night when we were alone. "I can take care of you." "But you're hardly ever home anymore," I pointed out. "Because I'm working," he snapped, then immediately softened his tone. "I'm working for us, Ash." Mom noticed the tension too. After 2 weeks, she announced she was heading home. "You seem stronger now, sweetheart," she said, though I could tell she was reluctant to leave. "But I'm just a phone call away if you need me." The next few weeks were a blur of medical tests and clinic visits. The house felt empty without Mom, and Robert was spending even more time away. But I forced myself to focus on my health, on getting through each day, on hoping for good news. Then finally, after what felt like an eternity, I got it. At my latest appointment, my doctor was actually smiling as he looked at my test results. "Mrs. Parker, I have good news," he said, and I felt my heart skip a beat. "The tumor is benign, and it's in a location where we can safely operate. The risk of complications is minimal." I burst into tears of relief. After all these weeks of uncertainty and fear, there was hope. Real hope. I couldn't wait to tell Robert. Maybe now things could go back to normal. Maybe all his strange behavior had just been stress about my condition. I practically floated out of the hospital, already planning how I would tell him the good news. I decided to head straight home, hoping to catch him before he left for work. I quietly inserted my key into the lock, but before I could open the door fully, I heard his voice from inside. He was talking loudly on the phone, apparently not expecting anyone home at this hour. "I can't take it anymore, Sarah. You don't know what it's like living with her," he was saying, his voice filled with disgust. "The constant smell of medicines in the house, her sickly appearance, it's just unbearable." My hand froze on the doorknob as he continued. I know. But you should see her now, she's nothing like the woman I married. Always weak, always complaining about headaches. I'm too young to be playing nurse to an invalid." Each word felt like a physical blow. I stood there, listening to my husband disparage me to another woman, my legs trembling beneath me. "Yeah, the money situation is being handled. We've got quite a bit in savings. Look, I'll figure something out. I just need to get out of this situation before she gets worse." I pushed the door open fully and stepped into the room. Robert spun around, the phone still pressed to his ear, his face draining of color when he saw me. "I'll call you back," he mumbled into the phone, ending the call. What was that all about? My voice came out steadier than I expected. For a moment, Robert just stared at me, caught off guard. Then his expression shifted, hardened. "Well, I guess you heard everything," he said, straightening his shoulders. "Maybe it's better this way. We need to talk." "Talk about what?" I asked, though I already knew what was coming. "I want a divorce, Ashley. And I want half of our savings." He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was discussing the weather. "Let's be realistic, you're sick, and I'm not going to spend the best years of my life taking care of an invalid. I need someone young, healthy. I deserve that." I stood there, absorbing his words, thinking about the good news I'd just received from the doctor. But looking at Robert now, I realized it wouldn't make any difference. This wasn't about my illness, it was about who he really was. "We need to do this quickly," he continued, gaining confidence from my silence. "Before your surgery. I'm not risking being legally tied to a disabled person if something goes wrong." "Fine," I said quietly. "I agree to the divorce." He seemed surprised by my quick agreement, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. "Good," he said, recovering quickly. "I'll go to a hotel tonight. I don't want to stay here anymore. I'll come back tomorrow to pack my things." "That's probably best," I replied, my voice hollow. Robert grabbed his jacket and wallet, not even bothering to pack an overnight bag. At the door, he paused for a moment, like he might say something else, then shook his head and left. After Robert left, I stood in our living room for what felt like hours, letting the reality of what had just happened sink in. Finally, I decided to start packing his things. I couldn't bear the thought of seeing him again tomorrow. As I moved around the house gathering his belongings, my eyes fell on his laptop, still open on the dining room table. I'd never been the type to snoop through my husband's things, but something compelled me to look at the screen. What I found made my knees buckle, and I had to grab the back of a chair for support. There, in full view, was a series of intimate messages between Robert and Sarah. As I scrolled through their conversation history, my stomach turned. There were explicit photos, intimate details of their encounters, and worst of all, cruel jokes about me. "Poor sick Ashley," Sarah had written. "At least her condition gives us more time together." "God, you should see her now," Robert had replied. "She looks like death warmed over. I can barely stand to look at her anymore." My hands were shaking as I continued scrolling, but what I found next made me gasp out loud. There was another conversation thread, this one with Amanda Wilson, my husband's boss's wife. The messages between them were equally intimate, filled with declarations of love and plans for secret meetings. "Does your husband suspect anything?" Robert had asked her. "John's clueless as always," she'd replied. "Too busy with work to notice what's happening under his nose." I felt sick, but I forced myself to keep reading. With trembling hands, I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures of everything, the messages, the photos, the timestamps. Something in me knew this might be important later. The divorce proceedings moved quickly after that. We didn't have much to untangle, no children, no property of our own. The house was rented, and our only joint asset was our savings account with the $200,000 we'd been saving for a down payment on a house. Money that had come primarily from my higher salary, though I'd never minded that imbalance before. Robert's lawyer, a shark in an expensive suit, had other ideas. "Your Honor," he argued during the proceedings, "while Mrs. Parker may have contributed more directly to the savings account, my client's contributions to the household were equally valuable. He managed all domestic duties, allowing Mrs. Parker to focus on her career. The money he earned went directly to household expenses, groceries, utilities, daily necessities." I watched as Robert nodded solemnly beside his lawyer, playing the role of the devoted househusband who'd sacrificed his own career advancement for our home. The same man who'd called me a burden just weeks before. The judge agreed with their argument. The court finds that both parties contributed equally to the marriage, albeit in different ways. The savings will be divided equally between Mr. and Mrs. Parker. Just like that, half of our savings, $100,000, went to Robert. The money I'd worked so hard to save, stayed late at the office for, taken on extra projects for, was now being split with the man who'd betrayed me in every possible way. After the divorce was finalized, Robert moved out immediately. I couldn't stay in that apartment either, too many memories, too much pain. My mother welcomed me home with open arms, just as she had when I was a scared teenager after my first breakup. 2 months after the divorce, I finally had my surgery. The procedure went exactly as the doctors had hoped. They successfully removed the tumor, and my recovery began immediately. Each day, I felt a little stronger, a little more like my old self. During my recovery, I stayed with my mother. She was my rock, just as she'd always been, but I started noticing she seemed more tired than usual. One evening, as we sat in her cozy living room drinking tea, she took my hand. "Ashley, sweetheart, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I've made a decision about my future. I found a wonderful nursing home, Sunset Gardens. It's peaceful, has excellent care, and I've already paid for my stay there." She squeezed my hand. "I want to spend my remaining years somewhere I won't be a burden." "Mom, you're not a burden." "Let me finish," she interrupted with a smile. "I've thought this through. The house will be yours, along with my savings, about $300,000. You deserve a fresh start after everything you've been through." I tried to argue, but Mom had that determined look I knew so well. A week later, I helped her move into Sunset Gardens. The place was beautiful, with gardens and activities, and Mom seemed genuinely excited about this new chapter in her life. After getting her settled, I returned to what was now my house. It felt strange being there alone, but also peaceful. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe freely. Life has a funny way of serving up moments of perfect timing. About a month after Mom's move, I was sitting in my favorite cafe, enjoying a quiet lunch break, when I heard a familiar voice. "Ashley, is that really you?" I looked up to see Robert's mother, Margaret, standing by my table, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. "Hello, Margaret," I said, gesturing for her to sit. "I can't believe it," she stammered. "Robert told us you were terminally ill," he said. She trailed off, looking embarrassed. I couldn't help but laugh. "He told you I was dying?" "Well, as you can see, I'm very much alive. Still working at Richardson Financial, actually. And Mom just left me her house. I'm planning to sell it and buy an apartment closer to work." Margaret's face went through a series of emotions before settling on something between shame and satisfaction. "You know," she said, leaning forward, "Robert's living with me now. That woman he left you for, Sarah, she took every penny he got from the divorce and then left him. He's got nothing now." I took a slow sip of my coffee, hiding my smile behind the cup. I didn't need to say anything. Margaret's tone told me she was as disgusted with her son's behavior as I was. "He made his bed," she added, shaking her head. "Now he has to lie in it." As I watched Margaret leave the cafe, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. I hadn't wished ill on Robert. I'd been too busy focusing on my own recovery to think much about him at all. But knowing that karma had dealt him such a perfect hand of justice? Well, I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel good. I was sorting through some old photos in my mother's living room when I heard aggressive pounding on the front door. Before I could even get up, the door burst open, and there stood Robert, his face red with anger and something else, desperation. "You lied to me," he shouted, storming into the house like he still had a right to be there. "My mother told me everything. You're completely fine." I stood up slowly, keeping the coffee table between us. "Get out of my house, Robert." "Your house?" He laughed bitterly. "The house your mother conveniently left you after our divorce? Along with all that money?" He ran his hands through his hair, a gesture I once found endearing but now saw as theatrical. "Ashley, baby, I made a mistake. I was scared and stupid. I still love you. We can start over. Love me? I felt a cold anger rising in my chest. You're a traitor, Robert. You abandoned me when I was sick. You cheated on me. I want nothing to do with you. Why didn't you tell me you were getting better? He demanded. Why didn't you tell me about your mother's plans to leave you all this? His voice cracked with what he probably thought was emotion, but I recognized as greed. You want to know why? I stepped closer to him. The day I found out my tumor was benign, the day I rushed home to tell you the good news, was the same day I heard you on the phone with your mistress, talking about what a burden I was. He had the decency to flinch at that, but recovered quickly. That's not fair, Ashley. You deliberately hid your mother's inheritance from me during the divorce. Half of all this belongs to me by law. No, it doesn't, I said firmly. Mom left me this inheritance after our divorce was final. You have no claim to it. Bullshit. He was shouting now, his face getting redder. You knew this was coming. You and your mother planned this. You hid assets during our divorce proceedings, that's illegal. I'll sue you, Ashley. I'll take you to court and prove that you deliberately concealed future assets during our divorce. You'll have to give me half of everything. I stood in my mother's living room, watching Robert's tirade with a calmness that seemed to infuriate him even more. When he finally paused for breath, I walked to my desk, pulled out my phone, and pulled up the photos I'd saved months ago. Before you continue threatening me, I said quietly, I think you should see something. I held up my phone, showing him the screenshots of his conversations with Amanda Wilson, his boss's wife. The color drained from his face. You remember Amanda, don't you? Your boss John's wife? I scrolled through the messages slowly, letting him see every damning detail. I wonder what John would think about these messages. About the photos. About all those lunch breaks you spent with his wife while claiming to work overtime. You wouldn't, he whispered, but his voice had lost all its previous bravado. I'm trying to recover from a serious illness, Robert. I don't need this stress. I don't need your threats. I don't need you bursting into my house making demands. I locked my phone and set it down. Leave me alone, or John gets copies of everything. Your choice. He stood there, mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Finally, he backed toward the door. You've changed, he said accusingly. No, Robert. I just stopped being afraid. After he left, I sat down and cried, not from sadness or fear, but from relief. It was truly over. The next few months were transformative. I sold my mother's house for an excellent price, thanks to the hot real estate market. With that money and the inheritance, I bought a beautiful apartment in a luxury building just 3 blocks from my office. The walk to work became my daily therapy, helping me rebuild my strength step by step. The illness had taken its toll on my body. I'd lost nearly 20 pounds during the worst of it. But slowly, I began to recover. I started taking yoga classes in my building's fitness center, gradually rebuilding my strength and flexibility. My appetite returned, and with it, my energy. My boss proved to be more understanding than I could have hoped for. Take all the time you need, she told me during my first week back. We're just glad to have you back with us. She arranged for me to work flexible hours, allowing me to attend my follow-up appointments and therapy sessions without stress. Sometimes, on my morning walks to work, I'd catch my reflection in the sleek glass buildings and barely recognize myself. Not because of the weight loss or the small scar hidden beneath my hair, but because of the confidence in my stride, the straightness of my spine, the lift of my chin. I was no longer the woman who had been afraid of being alone, of being sick, of being unloved. Through mutual acquaintances, I occasionally heard bits of news about Robert. He was still living with his mother, having blown through his divorce settlement with Sarah. Apparently, he'd had to leave his job at TradeWorks, though whether he quit or was fired, I never asked. It didn't matter anymore. My mother thrived at Sunset Gardens, making new friends and taking up watercolor painting. I visited her every Sunday, and we'd sit in the garden, drinking tea and talking about everything and nothing. She never said "I told you so" about Robert, never reminded me that she'd had doubts about him from the start. Instead, she would smile at me with pride and say, "You're blooming, sweetheart." She was right. Like the potted orchid on my new apartment's windowsill, a housewarming gift from my team at work, I was blooming. The tumor, the betrayal, the divorce, they hadn't destroyed me. They had forced me to grow stronger roots. My name is Brittany, and I was working in the marketing department at Carson & Associates when our paths crossed. David worked in sales, just down the hall from my office. It started innocently enough. We kept running into each other in the office kitchen during lunch breaks. I'd heat up my sad microwave meals while he'd unpack his perfectly organized bento boxes. "Those look way better than my frozen dinners," I said one day, eyeing his colorful lunch spread. He grinned and pulled out an extra set of chopsticks. "Want to try?" My mom taught me how to cook, though I'm pretty sure she regrets it now. I stopped falling for her special recipes pretty quickly. That first shared lunch turned into daily lunch dates. We'd sit at the small table by the window, trading stories about our lives. I told him about growing up with my sensible parents in the suburbs, about my grandmother who'd gifted me my apartment before she passed away. He talked about his work, his hobbies, his dreams, but rarely about his family. After 3 months of lunches, he finally asked me out properly. "Dinner tonight? Somewhere that doesn't have a microwave or plastic cutlery?" I said yes, and that's how our real story began. We dated for a year, and it was wonderful. David was thoughtful, funny, and kind. When he suggested moving in together, it made perfect sense. My apartment had plenty of space, and we were spending most nights together anyway. Everything was perfect, except for one thing: I'd never met his family. He'd met mine within the first few months of dating. But whenever I brought up meeting his family, David would change the subject or make vague excuses. One night, after we'd been living together for a few months, I finally confronted him about it. We were curled up on the couch, watching a movie, when I paused it and turned to face him. "David, why haven't I met your family yet? Are you ashamed of me or something?" He let out a heavy sigh, running his hands through his dark hair. "God, no, Britt. I'm not ashamed of you, I'm ashamed of them." I laughed, thinking he was joking. "Come on, they can't be that bad." "They are." His voice was dead serious. "They're different. They think everything is a joke, and I mean everything. Even important moments, serious situations, they turn everything into some kind of cruel prank." I remember raising my eyebrows, still not quite believing him. "What do you mean? You want examples? Fine." He sat up straighter, his jaw tense. "When I was in high school, I had my first girlfriend over for dinner. My mom served spaghetti, but she'd replaced the noodles with rubber worms. My date screamed and threw up at the table. Everyone thought it was hilarious, except me and Sarah. She never spoke to me again." I stared at him, waiting for the punchline. But there wasn't one. "Or how about when I had a big presentation in middle school? My brother replaced my notebook with an identical one filled with pornographic drawings. When I opened it in front of the class." He shook his head. "I got suspended for 2 weeks." As he continued sharing stories from his childhood, each one worse than the last, I began to understand why he'd been so hesitant to introduce me to his family. But I had no idea that I was about to become their next target. David proposed on a Tuesday. Nothing fancy, just the two of us in our kitchen, making breakfast. He pulled out a ring while I was flipping pancakes, and said, "I can't imagine my life without you, Britt. Will you marry me?" Of course, I said yes. And then, inevitably, came the words I'd been both dreading and curious about: "I guess it's time for you to meet my family." The Thompson family home was a charming 2-story colonial in the suburbs. Mrs. Thompson opened the door before we even reached the porch. She was a petite woman with David's warm brown eyes and a wide smile. Mr. Thompson stood behind her, tall and distinguished looking, and next to him was James, David's older brother. "Oh, finally!" Mrs. Thompson pulled me into a tight hug. We'd been dying to meet the woman who stole our David's heart. The initial conversation was surprisingly normal. We sat in their cozy living room, and they asked about my job, my family, how David and I met. They even cracked a few harmless jokes that made me laugh. I started to relax, thinking David had exaggerated their pranking tendencies. I caught him watching his family warily, like someone waiting for a bomb to explode. I thought he was being paranoid. "I'll get us some tea," Mrs. Thompson announced cheerfully. "Brittany, dear, how do you take yours?" "Just a splash of milk, please." When she returned with the tea tray, everyone was still chatting pleasantly. I took a big sip of my tea and immediately regretted it. My mouth exploded with salt and pepper, so much pepper it felt like I'd swallowed fire. I spat the tea back into the cup, but it was too late. My throat was burning. Tears streamed down my face as I coughed and gasped. The Thompsons burst into laughter. "Welcome to the family," James hooted. "Better get used to it, we love our little jokes." "That's how we show love here," Mr. Thompson added, wiping tears of laughter from his eyes. I ran to the kitchen, desperately searching for water. I found a glass and filled it with ice and water, drinking it in huge gulps. The pepper had made my nose run, and I could feel my carefully applied makeup streaming down my face along with my tears. From the living room, I could hear David's angry whispers, "What is wrong with you people? This isn't funny. She's going to be my wife." "Oh, lighten up," James replied. "It's just a joke." When I walked back into the living room, my face a mess of running mascara and smeared foundation, they took one look at me and started laughing again. "Look, she looks like a panda," James pointed at me, doubling over with laughter. That was the last straw for David. He jumped to his feet, his face red with anger. "You're all jerks. This is exactly why I didn't want to bring her here." He grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the door. In the car, David apologized over and over. I just hugged him, my face still burning from the pepper and humiliation. As we drove home, I realized David hadn't been exaggerating about his family at all. He'd been warning me. Planning a wedding is stressful enough, without having to worry about your future in-laws turning it into a practical joke playground. David and I spent weeks debating whether to invite his family at all. "We have to invite them," David finally said one night while we were addressing invitations. "They're still my parents, and no matter how much I hate their pranks, I'd regret not having them there." He called them the next day, putting the phone on speaker so I could hear. "Mom, Dad, listen carefully," his voice was stern. "You can come to the wedding, but I need your word, no pranks. This is the most important day of our lives, not a circus." "Of course, sweetheart," his mother chirped. "We'll behave, I promise." The day of the wedding started perfectly. The ceremony was beautiful, and during the reception, everything was going smoothly. David's family was actually behaving themselves, though I noticed David watching them like a hawk. Then came time for the cake cutting. Our cake was gorgeous, 4 tiers of white fondant with delicate sugar flowers cascading down the sides. But something was off. There were candles on it, lit candles. That wasn't part of our plan. I turned to David to mention it, but before I could get the words out, there was a loud pop. Then another, and another. The cake suddenly exploded, sending chunks of white cake and frosting flying everywhere. Most of it landed on me, completely ruining my wedding dress. For a moment, there was complete silence. Then I heard it, the familiar sound of the Thompsons' laughter. They were practically falling over themselves, pointing and howling with glee. "Your face," James gasped between laughs. "Oh my God, your face." I stood there, cake dripping down my dress, and burst into tears. Through my blurred vision, I saw David's face turn purple with rage. "Get out," he roared at his family. "Get out of my wedding right now." "You're overreacting," his mother said, looking bewildered. Everyone loves a good wedding prank. David didn't respond. Instead, he waved over the security team we'd hired, thank God for that decision, and had them escort his family out. My mother rushed over with napkins, trying to clean frosting off my face. My bridesmaids surrounded me protectively. Even David's Aunt Clara, who I'd just met that day, came over to help, shooting disgusted looks at her departing relatives. "I can't believe they're my brother's family," she muttered, helping to wipe cake from my hair. "This is a wedding, for heaven's sake, not a college fraternity party." Somehow, we salvaged the rest of the reception. Our friends and my family rallied around us, turning it into a joke we were all in on, rather than one at my expense. Someone found a backup cake. Apparently, our wedding planner had dealt with difficult families before, and we even managed to get some decent pictures taken after I changed into my backup dress. Life settled into a peaceful rhythm after the wedding disaster. David and I enjoyed our quiet existence in my grandmother's old apartment, far from his family's chaos. We transformed the spare bedroom into a home office, planning to use it that way for a few years, before maybe turning it into a nursery. But plans change. Just over a year after our wedding, I discovered I was pregnant. David was overjoyed, spinning me around our kitchen when I told him, though he quickly put me down when I turned green. We decided to keep it to ourselves for the first few months, telling only my parents. Somehow, though, news travels. I was 7 months along when David's phone rang one evening. "Your mother?" I asked, recognizing his expression. He nodded. "They know about the baby. Mom's insisting they have a right to meet their grandchild." I instinctively put my hands over my swollen belly. "No pranks around the baby," I said firmly. "Absolutely none," David agreed before answering the phone. When Emma was born, she was perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and David's warm brown eyes. We managed to keep the Thompsons away for the first 2 months, but their persistence wore us down. Just one visit, David negotiated with them. At our apartment, where we control the environment. "And if there's even a hint of a prank, you're out forever." They came on a Sunday afternoon. I watched them like a hawk as they cooed over Emma, looking for any sign of mischief. But they were surprisingly normal. Mrs. Thompson cradled Emma gently, tears in her eyes. Mr. Thompson proudly showed us pictures of his own father holding David as a baby. That visit led to others. They'd come over every few weeks, bringing appropriate gifts and behaving themselves. Still, I never fully relaxed around them. I refused every dinner invitation, remembering the pepper tea incident all too well. During one of their visits, while David was changing Emma's diaper, Mrs. Thompson started chatting about James. "Oh, he got married last month," she mentioned casually. "Such a small ceremony. Just at the courthouse. His Caroline refused to have a proper wedding." She shook her head disapprovingly. "I don't understand why." I bit my tongue to keep from saying, "Really? You don't understand why?" Instead, I just nodded, thinking about my own ruined wedding dress and exploding cake. I had a pretty good idea why Caroline opted for a courthouse ceremony, and honestly, I wished I'd done the same. In my head, I could imagine exactly how that conversation had gone between James and Caroline. She'd probably heard the stories about my wedding, or maybe she'd been subject to a few harmless pranks herself. Either way, smart girl, she'd found a way to avoid giving them any opportunity for their special brand of humor. Life has a way of shattering when you least expect it. One rainy Tuesday morning, David kissed Emma goodbye before school, kissed me goodbye before work, and walked out our door for the last time. A drunk driver ran a red light at 9:17 a.m. By 9:20, I was a widow. Emma didn't understand at first. She was only 7, too young to fully grasp the concept of never coming back. When I told her daddy had died, she asked if he'd be home for dinner. Each time she asked, my heart broke all over again. The days leading up to the funeral passed in a blur. My mother practically moved in, handling arrangements, while I sat in a daze on the couch, holding Emma. I couldn't cry anymore. I felt hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me. The Thompsons came to the funeral with James and his wife Caroline. I barely registered their presence until it was time for the eulogies. I'd already spoken, sharing memories of David as a husband and father, his kindness, his gentle humor, how he'd taught Emma to ride her bike just last month. Then his parents stood up to speak. David always loved a good joke, Mr. Thompson began, and I felt my stomach clench. Remember when he was 5, and we convinced him his teddy bear had come alive and eaten all his Halloween candy? Mrs. Thompson chimed in with a laugh. Or that time in college when we sent him a fake acceptance letter to medical school, even though he never applied? His face was priceless. The church was silent. No one laughed. I looked around and saw faces twisted in disbelief and secondhand embarrassment. Emma clutched my hand, confused. And now he's up there, Mr. Thompson continued, grinning, probably planning the ultimate prank on St. Peter. I felt something snap inside me. My whole body started shaking with rage. Emma must have felt it because she looked up at me with worried eyes. After the service, while people were gathering for the reception, I approached the Thompsons. My voice was quiet but sharp enough to cut glass. "How dare you?" I hissed. "How dare you turn my husband's funeral into a joke?" "Oh, Brittany," Mrs. Thompson reached for my arm. David would have appreciated the humor. He always did. I jerked away from her touch. No, he tolerated it. What you do is cruel and thoughtless. I never want to see any of you again. You're not welcome in our lives anymore. Emma and I are done with all of you. But we're family, Mrs. Thompson protested, finally looking concerned. No, I said firmly. We're not. Family doesn't humiliate each other. Family doesn't ruin weddings or mock funerals. We're done. I turned and walked away, leaving them standing there, probably still wondering what they'd done wrong. They'd never understood, and they never would. 5 years passed like a blur. Emma grew from a grieving 7-year-old into a thoughtful 12-year-old who had her father's kind eyes and gentle spirit. I threw myself into being both mother and father, trying to fill the David-shaped hole in our lives. We heard bits and pieces about the Thompsons through the grapevine. James had 2 kids now. I'd seen pictures on social media of 2 boys with his mischievous grin. I always quickly scrolled past, determined to keep that chapter of our lives firmly closed. Sometimes Emma would ask about them, especially around holidays or when her friends talked about their grandparents. I never told her about the exploding wedding cake or the funeral jokes. She had enough complicated feelings about losing her dad without adding that mess to it. Then came the phone call, 3 days before Christmas. "Brittany?" Mrs. Thompson's voice was older, softer somehow. "Please don't hang up." I almost did anyway, but Emma was sitting next to me on the couch, working on her homework. She looked up, curious. "We miss Emma," Mrs. Thompson continued. "And you. Please, would you consider spending Christmas with us? The whole family will be there, James and Caroline, their boys. We'd love to see you both." I started to say no, but Emma, who had obviously figured out who was calling, began nodding enthusiastically. Her eyes were pleading. "There will be absolutely no pranks," I said firmly. "No jokes, no tricks, nothing like that. Just a normal Christmas dinner." "We promise," Mr. Thompson's voice joined in. They must have been on speakerphone. "We swear on David's memory. No pranks." Maybe it was the mention of David, or maybe it was Emma's hopeful face, but I found myself agreeing. "We'll come," I said. "But I mean it about the pranks." After hanging up, Emma and I went shopping. If we were doing this, we were doing it right. We picked out top-of-the-line kitchen appliances for the Thompsons, the latest tablet for James and Caroline, and the season's hottest toys for their boys. "Do you think Grandma and Grandpa got me something nice?" Emma asked as we wrapped the gifts. "I'm sure they did, sweetheart," I said, hoping I wasn't lying. "They've had 5 years to think about it." Emma threw herself into choosing wrapping paper and writing cards. I watched her excitement grow and prayed I wasn't making a horrible mistake by letting the Thompsons back into our lives. The Thompson house looked exactly the same as I remembered it, decorated with twinkling Christmas lights and a wreath on the door. Emma squeezed my hand as we walked up the path, our arms full of carefully wrapped presents. James and his family were already there when we arrived. His wife Caroline gave me a warm, almost apologetic smile as she helped us with our coats. Their boys, Mike and Tommy, hovered shyly behind their parents. The gift-giving started promisingly. Emma and I handed out our presents, and the reactions seemed genuine. Mrs. Thompson teared up over the expensive coffee maker, Mr. Thompson was thrilled with his new tablet, and the boys' faces lit up at their gaming consoles. Then came our turn. Mrs. Thompson handed Emma a wrapped box with a big smile, while Mr. Thompson passed me a similar one. Emma's fingers trembled slightly as she unwrapped hers, her first gift from her grandparents in 5 years. I'll never forget the look on her face when she opened that box. Inside was a plastic toy designed to look like dog poop, along with some clearly marked down items from the clearance bin. Emma's lower lip quivered as she stared at the contents. The laughter started immediately. Mr. Thompson and James were practically howling. Even the boys joined in, pointing at Emma's face. "Oh my God, look at them," James gasped between laughs. "Their expressions are priceless." My own box contained similar junk, expired candy, and items that still had clearance stickers on them. "That's enough," I said, my voice deadly quiet. "Where are the real presents?" Mrs. Thompson wiped tears of laughter from her eyes. "What do you mean? Those are the presents." "You can't be serious." I looked at each of them. "You haven't seen your granddaughter in 5 years, and you give her fake dog poop as a Christmas present?" They exchanged confused looks. "It's funny," Mr. Thompson insisted. "Come on, Brittany, learn to take a joke." I watched a tear roll down Emma's cheek, and something snapped inside me. Without a word, I stood up and walked over to Mike and Tommy. "I'm sorry, boys," I said, taking back the gaming consoles. "But these are returning to the store." "Mom," they wailed as I moved on to James and Caroline, collecting the tablet and other gifts. "Brittany, this is cruel," Mrs. Thompson protested as I took back their presents too. "Cruel?" I turned on her. "You gave a 12-year-old girl who lost her father fake dog poop for Christmas, and you're calling me cruel?" "It was just a joke," James started, but I cut him off. "We're leaving, Emma," I said. "Get your coat." The drive home was quiet. Emma stared out the window, clutching her empty gift bag. "I'm sorry, sweetheart," I finally said. "I really thought they'd changed." "It's okay, Mom," she replied softly. "Can we watch Christmas movies and make hot chocolate when we get home?" "Of course we can. We'll have our own Christmas, just us two." And that's exactly what we did. We spent the rest of Christmas Day in our pajamas, watching holiday movies, baking cookies, and trying to forget about the Thompsons and their idea of humor. The day after Christmas, I was scrolling through Facebook when I saw James's post. "Terrible Christmas yesterday. My sister-in-law showed her true colors, cruelly taking back Christmas presents from my crying children. Some people just don't understand family traditions and humor. My poor boys were heartbroken. Bad aunt, Christmas ruined." The comments flooded in immediately. "How horrible. What kind of person takes presents from children? She sounds toxic." My hands were shaking as I typed my response. "Let me tell you what really happened at Christmas yesterday." "You want to talk about cruel? Let me tell you about your family traditions. After 5 years of no contact, your parents gave their only granddaughter, a 12-year-old girl who lost her father, a toy that mimics dog feces as a Christmas present. They gave me clearance bin items with price tags still attached. Then they laughed at our pain. But this isn't new behavior. Let me tell you all about my wedding day, where they rigged our wedding cake to explode in my face. Or about my husband's funeral, where they thought it was appropriate to turn their son's eulogy into a stand-up comedy routine about pranking him as a child. You want to talk about toxic family traditions? Let's talk. I hit post and waited. Within minutes, other relatives started chiming in. Oh God, remember Cousin Sarah's graduation? They replaced her diploma with a joke certificate during the photo op. They put laxatives in the punch at my baby shower. They ruined my son's bar mitzvah with that trick Torah scroll. The tide turned quickly. Soon, James's original post was flooded with people sharing their own stories of the Thompsons' pranks. Caroline, James's wife, even liked several of the comments. The phone call started that evening. First James, Brittany, I never thought about it like that. Reading everyone's stories. God, we've been awful, haven't we? Then Mr. and Mrs. Thompson. We never meant to hurt anyone, Mrs. Thompson said, her voice shaking. We thought everyone was laughing with us. We thought it was all in good fun. We've always been this way, Mr. Thompson added. It's how we show love. But maybe we've been showing it wrong. I took a deep breath. You have to understand, your pranks aren't funny. They're cruel, they hurt people. They hurt your granddaughter. We see that now, Mrs. Thompson whispered. Can you ever forgive us? I don't know, I answered honestly. I'm glad you're finally realizing how your behavior affects others, but I can't just forget everything that's happened. 2 days later, a delivery truck brought a large package. Inside was the latest iPhone, the exact one Emma had been dreaming about, along with a heartfelt letter of apology from her grandparents. I sent James's boys their gaming consoles back, with a note, everyone deserves a real Christmas. Now, 6 months later, we have a cautious peace. We meet occasionally for coffee or lunch in neutral places. The Thompsons are really trying, to change. No more pranks, no more cruel jokes. Emma video chats with her cousins sometimes, and I've seen genuine remorse in my in-laws' eyes. David would be proud of this progress, I think. He always hoped his family would understand someday. Maybe they finally do.